The philosopher Plotinus, who is considered the founder of Neoplatonism, was born in about 205 CE to a Greek family in Egypt. After decades studying under the Platonic philosopher Ammonius Saccas, Plotinus established the first Neoplatonic school in Rome. Today Plotinus is known for his magisterial Enneads, which represent the great synthesis of Platonic thought and the pinnacle of classical philosophy. Importantly though, Plotinus did not consider philosophy as a merely speculative enterprise, but a way of living and a means of transformation. Ultimately, philosophy should be the journey of its practitioners back home, back to their source in the transcendent, the flight of the alone to the alone. Following Plato, Plotinus conceived of philosophy as a preparation for death. Although Plotinus did not see his own teachings as distinct from Plato, what marks him out as distinct is his intense focus on the subject of the all-transcendent, ineffable One. Plato mentions the One only in passing in the Republic. Plato describes the One as beyond being, and equal to the form of the good. But the whole spirit of Platonic philosophy can be characterized by the command of Socrates to become like God. In other words, return to the One. According to Plotinus, quote, "Our concern is not to be free of sin, but to be God." Plotinus also says that the soul must become all things, and so is more explicit about the purpose of philosophy ultimately being a religious one. The great Plotinian goal is to discard from consciousness all that is not the One. The supreme goal of human life is to be united to the good which is above all things. This spiritual ascent is not a theoretical objective of reason, but is a movement in consciousness and spirit, which transforms one's being and brings an inner unification and union with the divine. The mystical character to Plotinus' philosophy sets him apart from other philosophers in the Western tradition, and makes Plotinus an interesting figure as one whose philosophy appears in some ways closer to an approach that is much more familiar to traditional Eastern modes of thought. When we talk of the mystical character of Plotinus and Neoplatonism generally, we are bound to run into a common criticism of all forms of Platonism, which says that it is a dualistic philosophy that denigrates the world as an imperfect copy of imagined ideal spiritual forms. But there is no real dualism present in Neoplatonism. In the philosophy of Plotinus, this world, while not the highest level of reality, becomes both a vision and a consummation of the One, and the means by which individual souls can ascend to the good. Neoplatonist philosophy is a kind of qualified non-dualism, in which the realities of this world are not denied, but given their explanation as part of a great chain of being which emanates from and depends upon the One, which alone exists by itself. It was Plotinus who wrote scathingly against the Gnostics, whose condemnation of the physical world was abhorrent to him. As a proponent of the great non-dual synthesis of Platonic thought, Plotinus reacted as harshly to those who would excessively glorify the spiritual world over the sensible world, as he did to those who glorified the sensible at the expense of the spiritual. For Plotinus, to erect this kind of division was to miss the point entirely. How can this world, with the gods which it contains, be separated from the spiritual world? Those who despise what is so nearly akin to the spiritual world prove that they know nothing of the spiritual world, except in name. For those who are familiar with the beauty of the spiritual world is full of echoes of that beauty and harmony. The more we take a comprehensive, less selfish view of things, the more we will be convinced of the world's divine origin. Plotinus did not consider the spiritual world an original cosmic state from which we are separated until death, or the mercy of salvation through divine grace. Instead, for Plotinus, the spiritual world is the deepest level of our own self. And so those who posit another world from this world have in fact missed the point entirely. Spirit and soul are everywhere and nowhere. But if we see retreat into our innermost self as a fleeing from the world, here too we would be mistaken. Each expansion of the self, Plotinus says, brings more and more of the external world into ourselves. We are in heaven whenever we, quote, "in heart and mind remember God." We are immersed in matter whenever we forget God. And the spiritual can always be reached by returning within oneself. Often I reawaken from my body to myself. I come to be outside other things, and inside myself. what an extraordinarily wonderful beauty I then see. It is then, above all, that I believe I belong to the greater portion. I then realize the best form of life. I become at one with the divine, and I establish myself in it. Once I reach this supreme activity, I establish myself above every other spiritual entity. Here Plotinus situates himself, and thus the soul generally, within a hierarchy of realities which extends from the supreme level, God, to the opposite extreme of the level of matter, which for Plotinus is not any kind of solid stuff, but the absolute deprivation of being. Thus the world, and by extension our souls, ascends and descends along the various rungs of the cosmic hierarchy, from appearance to reality. The same thing may be form in relation to the level of reality below it, and matter in relation to what is above it. The soul is a wanderer through all fields of existence. Here is William Inge's summary of the world of Plotinus. Plotinus conceives the universe as a living chain of being, an unbroken series of ascending or descending values and existences. The whole constitutes a harmony. Each inferior grade is in the next above. Each existence is vitally connected with all others. But these grades which are inferior in value are also imperfectly real, so long as we look at them in disconnection. They are characterized by impermanence and inner discord, until we set them in their true relations to the whole. Then we perceive them to be integral parts of the eternal systole and diastole in which the life of the universe consists, a life in which there is nothing arbitrary or irregular. Seeing that all is ordered by the necessity that eternal principles should act in accordance with their own nature, the perfect and unchangeable life of the divine spirit overflows in an incessant stream of creative activity, which spends itself only when it has reached the lowest confines of being, so that every possible manifestation of divine energy, every hue of the divine radiance, every variety in degree as well as in kind, is realized somewhere and somehow. And by the side of this outward flow of creative energy, there is another current which carries all the creatures back toward the source of their being. It is this centripetal movement that directs the active life of all creatures endowed with soul. They were created and sent into the world that they might be moulded a little nearer to the divine image by yearning for the home which they have left. This aspiration, which slumbers even in unconscious beings, is the mainspring of the moral, intellectual, and aesthetic life of mankind. Plotinus expounds on this view of the world as a great chain of being, which was taken for granted among Platonists. Following Plato, Plotinus argues that to be is to be a unity, to be one. Anything that exists, exists in virtue of the integration of its components into an intelligible whole. To be is to partake in wholes or organic hierarchies, all the way up to the absolutely unitary one. All beings are beings by the one, both those that are primary beings and those that are in any way said to be among beings. For what would something be if it were not one? If they are deprived of the one which is said of them, they are not those things. For neither does an army exist if it will not be one, nor a chorus, nor a herd if they are not one. Where there is no unity, there is nothing. Unity as integration is the difference between being and non-being. Each degree of reality can be explained with reference to its superior level. The unity of the body is explained by the unity of the soul animating it, and the soul in turn is illuminated by the higher spirit. And finally, we cannot understand the life of the spirit itself without the absolute simplicity of perfect unity, the divine principle of the one or the good. The one is both the object and the cause of desire, as it is both the origin and the reason for being. It is the source, therefore, of being, and the why of being given both at once. Plotinus is ultimately a kind of mystical empiricist. He does not present rationalist metaphysical systems and expect the reader to accept them just in virtue of their explanatory power. Instead, Plotinus' philosophy has an experiential goal. He believes ultimate reality can be grasped in itself through a mystical experience that transcends the dualities of everyday cognition. All these levels of reality described are also levels of the self. This true self, this self in God, is within ourselves, and during certain privileged experiences we can identify ourselves with it. Plotinus suggests a simple shift in consciousness as the means to realization. We must not look, but must, as it were, close our eyes and exchange our faculty of vision for another. We must awaken this faculty which everyone possesses, but few people ever use. Consciousness for Plotinus is like a mirror. If turned in a certain direction, it will reflect the objects that present themselves to it. Plotinus says that the soul that beholds beauty becomes beautiful. The problem is that our consciousness becomes bound up with concerns for the corporeal world. This is the true fall of the soul. We become attached to vanities and become forgetful of our true nature. Now, many have noted the similarity of this kind of description to what is commonly found in Eastern philosophy. And the Advaita teacher Swami Krishnananda said, Plotinus, the celebrated mystic, comes nearest in his views to the Vedanta philosophy, and is practically in full agreement with the Eastern sages, both in his theory and in his methodology. The mystical message of the Aeneids can also be compared to the Bhagavad Gita, because the path which Plotinus advocates is intended to lead the reader from ego-centered particularity to spiritual universality, a final state that sounds very like the Hindu idea of moksha, the union with Brahman, or in Plotinian terms, the one or the good which lies beyond the true universe of nous. The kind of inward transformation suggested by Plotinus involves directing concentration inwardly and raising our perspective to the higher unity above. It appears then that one who intends to know what intellect is should observe soul, especially the most divine part of it. This could perhaps occur in the following way. If you first separated in thought the body from the human being, I mean from yourself, and next the lower soul that shapes the body, and of course all sense perception, appetites and passions and other such irrelevancies, since these all tend towards the mortal, and what actually remains of soul is this, that which we called an image of intellect, preserving something of its light, in a way like the light of the sun which shines around it and out of it beyond its spherical mass. And so Plotinus believes that by a kind of mental subtraction, ceasing identifying with sensory perception and other bodily attachments, we can come to identify with what is most real in us, which is spirit. But the kind of shift in attention Plotinus desires is not just the contemplation of spirit. Even if we raise ourselves up to this level, we will generally not be able to remain there for long. For Plotinus, our consciousness is more of a memory than a presence. As it is bound up in time, it is always presenting us images which it tries to fixate with language. But the more intense an activity is, the more we are fully ourselves, and the more our consciousness subsides and makes way for our real self, which is characterized by total presence and simplicity. Today's psychologists talk about the so-called flow state, the state of complete presence we reach when totally immersed in a task. This seems to be the phenomenon Plotinus is identifying. He points to two activities specifically where we are fully awake, yet not conscious of what we are doing. He uses the examples of attentively reading and engaging in great acts of courage. Even when we are awake, we can find a great many fine activities, meditations, and actions which are not accompanied by consciousness at the very moment when we are meditating or acting. A person who is reading, for example, is not necessarily aware that he is reading, especially if he is reading attentively. Likewise, a person who performs a courageous act is not aware, at the moment that he performs the act, that he is acting courageously. This idea of a way of living which is fully awake, yet absent of discursive thought, has pervaded Buddhist teaching and practices, and the practices associated with this approach have been promoted under the banner of mindfulness. In On Happiness, Plotinus says that this kind of awareness is superior because it is more unified. As our soul becomes more unified, we feel less drawn in by objects and desires. Far from fleeing the physical world into spirit, we begin to experience the world in a clearer, more intense way. But where must we look to see things as they are? Plotinus writes, "Since we look towards the outside, away from the point at which we are all joined together, we are unaware of the fact that we are one. We are like faces turned towards the outside, but attached on the inside to one single head. If we could turn around, either spontaneously, or if we were lucky enough to have Athena pull us by the hair, then all at once we would see God, ourselves, and the all." God then is total presence, or to put it in Plotinus' words, the first nature is present to all things. Present, but how? Like one single life which is within all things. Life is a presence which always precedes us and contains us. It is always already there no matter where we look. As Pierre Hadot writes, with this experience of total presence, we touch upon the most profound point of the Platonian experience of life. Life is total presence, since it is a simple, infinite force which diffuses itself in dynamic continuity. Plotinus sees this life from within as pure movement which is everywhere and unceasing. It is already there prior to the particular forms it engenders, and it does not cease in them. However far we go in the direction of the infinitely small or the infinitely large, the movement of life will always be beyond us, because we are within it. The more we seek it, the less we find. If, however, we give up seeking it, then it is there, because it is pure presence. Everything distinct which we had previously conceived or perceived only led us further away from it. Plotinus writes far less on virtue than Plato or Aristotle, and this is partly because as someone more focused on direct mystical experience, Plotinus is less interested in things pertaining to everyday life. The highest virtue for Plotinus just is that mystical contemplation of the One. What is virtue for the soul? It is what she obtains as a result of her conversion. And what is this? Contemplation. Nevertheless, Plotinus does devote some time to discussing what the virtuous life is aside from the ultimate virtue of contemplation of the One. Plotinus denotes two kinds of virtue, corresponding to two different levels of human reality. As mentioned, there is the higher virtue of the pure soul, the spiritual man whose proper activity is thinking and, more importantly, contemplation. There is also the lower virtues that apply to the composite, that is, the part of ourselves which corresponds to the mixture of the soul and the body. It is here that passions, fears, desires, pain and pleasure are produced. Because the sage refuses to identify with the body, he is in some sense beyond this kind of virtue. What may be implicit in Plato and Aristotle becomes explicit in Plotinus. All virtue is directed toward experiencing the divine presence. Virtue is a metamorphosis of our experience. Virtues like justice, strength, or prudence are all means to purifying the soul to this end. Virtue, as Plotinus uses the term, means eliminating from the psyche all that is not spirit or the One. What remains is not any particular good or experience, but the good itself. If he is virtuous, he has all he needs for well-being and the acquisition of good, for there is no good that he has not got. For Plotinus, happiness is not the result of any outward circumstance. A person who possesses the good is necessarily happy. Happiness or bliss is inseparable from being itself, as in the terms used in Hinduism to describe ultimate reality as Sat Chit Ananda, or being, consciousness, bliss. The One is the source of being, and the One contemplating its own nature is bliss.